The Cowboy and the Cross, the Bill Watts story, rebellion, wrestling, and redemption. Chapter 20, AEW. When I sold the UWF in 1987, as far as I was concerned, I was out of the business for good. I never went looking for a way to get back in. The business ended up coming for me. WCW was Turner Broadcasting's wrestling company. TBS bought it when Jim Crockett was going under in '88. WCW was never a moneymaker because all it had to show in terms of proceeds were the gates from the live shows and pay-per-view. Pay-per-view was a big change in the business, allowing us to put on huge shows for nationwide audiences. Tanch Cox, Turner's attorney and someone I'd known for nearly 20 years, contacted me in early '92 and asked if I'd be interested in taking over WCW as executive vice president. Tanch was one of Ted's personal lawyers and not a network guy. He had represented us in the antitrust suit with Gunkel when I was working in Georgia, and apparently he was impressed with the way I did business. He later told me he said to Turner,
"You know, there's only one guy who can come in and straighten out this mess."
He still is someone I have a lot of respect for. Tench and I talked, and shortly after that, Bob Doohy gave me a call. Bob was the guy they were going to have running the wrestling division. He was managing the Omni when Ted bought it and changed it to the CNN Center. Bob was always successful because he was a good people person and a sharp guy. But when they cleared out the old WCW vice president Kip Frey, they had Bob take his position. And Bob wasn't a wrestling guy, though, and after we talked, he asked me to run the wrestling end of things. I thought about it and decided to accept the WCW offer, even though I really wasn't doing so wholeheartedly. I'd grown stronger in my faith, but getting back into the wrestling business got me back into the mindsets I'd been trying to get away from. All the anger and the obsession with sex returned. I fought it, but it just kept creeping into my consciousness. I didn't cheat, but my marriage to Sandy started falling apart almost as soon as I started with WCW, although I don't think it would have ultimately survived anyway. Coming back to wrestling was like taking a recovered alcoholic and making them a bartender. I knew I'd been making trouble for my faith, but this was the industry I had spent most of my life in. And the offer was $7,000 a week. In the previous 5 years, I hadn't really found a role for myself. When I got out of the business in '87, I thought I was smart enough to make money at anything. But by '92, I was wondering if I was competent for anything but wrestling. I was making a living at the things I was doing, but I certainly wasn't setting any records. I sure didn't consider myself successful, and I was getting really disenchanted with omnitrition. Plus, I was in a very mercurial marriage. But here was a business that I'd always had a knack for, and WCW was offering me a lot of money to come back. They were also offering me autonomy. And that's what they said anyway. A lot of how we react to things is based on our own self-esteem, and my self-esteem wasn't very high at this time. I might not have known what I was doing with omnitrition or with Sandy, but one thing was for sure. I did know the wrestling business. But I was still eaten up with this inner conflict about whether wrestling was a business for me to be involved in, which made it even harder for me to function as WCW's leader, a job meant for a Superman, something I certainly wasn't. WCW was the most screwed up company in the world. Here's just one example of how bad it was. Before I got there, they spent $30,000 on a survey to find out what wrestling fans wanted to see. The fans wanted something more serious, more believable. They wanted the tough wrestling, the old NWA style they'd been educated on. In other words, the total opposite of Vince McMahon's cartoon-like characters in soap opera. Jim Herd, TBS's head of WCW, responded to that by trying to copy Vince's gimmickry instead. Vince was the originator of his concept, so for WCW to attempt to copy him was ludicrous and an expensive failure. When I came into WCW, Jim Ross showed me that survey, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. I thought, my gosh, this is exactly what I do. And even in 92, I don't think it was too late to restore some believability to wrestling, or at least that old sense of mystery. There was no reason WCW should have been trailing the WWF. Vince had only his wrestling company, while Turner Broadcasting had 30 companies to sustain it. I wanted to use those resources to win the war for the fans. We had free specials called Clash of the Champions that aired periodically on TBS in primetime. I wanted to run those shows directly opposite of Vince's pay-per-views and make people choose. Turner Broadcasting's legal department, though, told me we couldn't do that because it was unfair competition and could be considered restraint of trade. Isn't it amazing that after I left WCW, they later put on a show directly opposite of Monday Night Raw, Vince's flagship program? In 92, I was already saying,
if we're going to compete with McMahon, then let's compete. Everything we can drain off of him will hurt him a lot more than it would hurt us. And since we're going to give away Clash of the Champions shows anyways, for the sake of television ratings, let's put it where it'll do us the most good. Directly against his pay-per-view events.
If we could have knocked 10% off the number of pay-per-views sold, it would have hurt. And initially, my primary objective was to cut losses to stop the bleeding. One thing that was different from later, when Eric Bischoff took over and had his run, was that when I was there, the revenues from all our TV shows aired on TBS went to TBS and not to WCW. This meant that WCW was always a money loser, and one of my mandates was to cut losses as much as possible. But I also saw some other areas where I thought I could affect some positive change. The key venue for World Championship Wrestling on TBS had always been the Omni, but by 1992, it had fallen on hard times. The gates were down to about 25% of what they had been in the previous years. Things had become so bad that WCW was only rarely running the Omni, and that was the company's hometown arena. There was no excuse for WCW to have lousy attendance at the Omni. In wrestling, you have to find the town that was the base of your promotion. In Florida, working for Eddie Graham, it had been Tampa. We ran Tampa every week, and as I wrote earlier, as Tampa went, that was how the territory went. That was generally the case. There was always a town that was your flagship town, and you could gauge what was getting over and how hot business was by what was getting over in that town and how hot it was. In Louisiana, it was New Orleans for Mid-South. In Mississippi, it was Jackson. In Oklahoma, it was Tulsa. The same thing applied a few years later when I worked for Vince McMahon, and I always told him no matter what, he had to keep Madison Square Garden strong. But here we were with the Omni's attendance in the dump. We worked on some things to rebuild attendance in the Omni, and we were successful. I knew there was no use copying Vince because no one was going to outdo what he did. Vince was a genius in his own right, extremely creative. No one was going to make a copy that was better than what he originated. The only way to have a truly viable competitive product would be to do something different. So we started doing things differently. What I wanted to do was what I'd always had success doing, showing that my guys were the toughest guys around, so I made some changes. I got rid of the foam mats around the ring. They really didn't do any good anyway. To me, having those mats was a good way for the guys to get hurt by hitting the crease between the mats and twisting an ankle. Heck, we wrestlers had been hitting concrete from the ring our whole lives. The response to the move was,
But the wrestlers could get hurt on the concrete.
My response was,
Well, yeah, but our guys were tough guys.
it made for a great talking point, and I was actually making the ringside area safer while selling the idea that it was more dangerous.
Oh my, that Bill Watts is going to make someone get hurt.
Well, golly, we put a little danger back into wrestling. How about that? Another change I made was to make moves off the top rope an automatic disqualification, which had always been the rule in Mid-South. The reaction to that was,
Oh no, He just eliminated all the high flying.
No, I just wanted the guys to sneak it, not to do it right out in the front of the referee. Wrestling had always needed rules, or else there's no heat. Everything a heel does means nothing if it's totally in front of the referee. If there are no rules and anything goes, you're not going to be able to create controversy, and you have got to be able to create controversy. Having rules and opportunities for guys to break those rules puts some strategy in. Emotionally, you can capitalize on them. Wrestlers had done that for years with great success. In WCW, I found myself having to deal with corporate people. I'd always had differences with other people in every company I was in, but dealing with non-wrestling people in a corporate environment was a whole nother world altogether. One of the few good ones was Bob Dewey. If we'd been allowed to do everything that Bob had told me we would, I think we really could have turned WCW around. But there was one dominating factor that negated any amount of good that Bob or I might have wanted to do, and that factor was Bill Shaw. Bill was a TBS executive in human resources, and he was the guy that Bob and I both had to report to. He in turn was the guy who reported to Ted Turner, but in my opinion, Bill Shaw had no integrity and no principles. And he didn't want to see Bob Dewey or Bill Watts do well. You see, when Turner took over the Omni, he also inherited Bob's contract, which was based on performance, and he'd done a heck of a job, which meant he was getting paid well. I didn't immediately realize what Bill Shaw's problem with Bob was when I figured out later that Bill was constantly undermining Bob and me because he was resentful that each of us made more money than he did. Well, at least that's what I was told. Ultimately, I think he wanted Bob's job, and I was just a guy in the way. Bill Shaw knew nothing about the wrestling business, but he was the guy we had to report to. At one point, I felt like Shaw tried to turn Bob and me against each other, telling Dewey that I complained about him. That was when I figured out Shaw's agenda, and I told Bob,
"That's bullshit. You know that if I have a problem with you, I'd come and confront you about it face to face. He's after your job, Bob."
I tried to talk directly to Ted about it, but every time I did, he'd say,
"Tell Shaw what the problem is, and then he'll get it to me."
And I wanted to scream, "Ted, Shaw's the fucking problem." But the corporate politics didn't end there, and I also got into it with Turner Broadcasting's accountant, who reported to another guy in another department. And this accountant was trying to tell me what we could and couldn't do. And it was amazing to him when we brought in the losses to such a small amount. I eventually made some progress with him, but not a lot. And the corporate structure kept me from firing people who simply weren't doing their jobs because every one of them had a daddy somewhere in the company to protect him or her. And that daddy might not even be in WCW, but in CNN or wherever. It was such a convoluted place. In many ways, it seemed as if WCW was the red-headed stepchild of Turner Broadcasting. We got our equipment that was left over from other stations in the company, from cameras to editing equipment. Even our production people told us we got the short end of the stick in this. How was a company with that mindset going to take on Vince McMahon, who had the absolute best of everything? He spared no expense on his production, whereas Turner Broadcasting was strangling its wrestling company. I felt that the TBS station manager had an obvious bias against wrestling. He always wanted to replace wrestling with a movie package. And one thing Ted Turner understood, though, was wrestling's appeal to the masses. He'd built that superstation from a tiny UHF channel in Atlanta, and a lot of that success had come from wrestling. It always had the highest overall and consistent ratings of anything on his station. And I remember the World Series with the Atlanta Braves in the finals. Drew bigger ratings than the wrestling shows, but that was about it. Year after year, wrestling was above the station average, and they had us producing a lot of hours of television each week. The amount of production was just unreal. And that also diluted the product because you can mix things only so many ways. But they had us producing so much because our ratings were awesome, which translated into commercial dollars for the station. Despite the success, we had these geniuses coming to the station with either no understanding of wrestling or a disdain for it. They wanted to replace it with movies, figuring they would be cheaper. But I'm here to tell you that the movie packages ran out too. Once you play the same damn thing 900 times. Here's something else I never understood. Vince merchandised WWF events so well as home videos. But Turner Broadcasting was a media empire with incredible resources, and in the unlikely event they made a WCW show into a home video, the packaging looked amateur to me. TBS should have excelled at that kind of thing, but Vince kicked our ass at every aspect of merchandising, and for that matter, in every other department. There were entire affiliates in Turner Broadcasting that could have made WCW into a real powerhouse, but it seemed as if money wrestling made wasn't as good as money made from a baseball game or a movie. There is no other excuse for why WCW shouldn't have been beating the WWF at everything, from international syndication to videotape sales to merchandising. And to me, the things that they did spend money on were ludicrous. They did one video trailer to promote a pay-per-view with Sting and Vader where they helicoptered the guys in. It was Vader's Mountain Chamber. They spent $80,000 on this trailer. They had a casting call for midgets. The way I remember, this was all the brainchild of Sharon Sadello, one of the vice presidents who later became Miss Ole Anderson. Yes. If you wanted to see fiscal irresponsibility, Turner Broadcasting was a great place to look. And when I was leaving, they were having an independent guy come in and conduct a company-wide investigation. I don't know how it came out because I was gone by the time it was done. Although I'd bet Shaw managed to castigate me as much as he could. But when I talked to the investigator, he said to me,
I have never seen a company with so many different divisions where all 30 companies are more interested in fighting for their own spots than in cooperating.
And he was right. There was no real cooperation between the companies within Turner Broadcasting. Like I said, I don't know what the consultant put in his final report, but I'm fairly sure that he did what most of them do, and that's tell the bosses what they want to hear so the consultant can get to the next contract. As it turned out, the only person I could fully trust in WCW was Jim Ross. Without Jim, I'd never gone into WCW in the first place. I just wouldn't have wanted to be there without him. Jim had stayed on as an announcer when I sold the UWF in '87 and had gradually become one of WCW's key people. He was invaluable because he knew production, announcing, booking, syndication. He ate, slept, and drank the wrestling business. The bottom line was that we were wrestling people, reporting to people with no understanding of wrestling. Not long after I got there, we had a main event, a cage match that ended up being pretty bloody. And I immediately got the edict from Shaw.
No more blood.
I guess if somebody got busted open unintentionally and started bleeding, we would have had to have someone running into the ring and ordering the match to stop while we went off the air. That was just insane. Sanitizing wrestling took the drama out of it, the thrill of the physicality and the element of danger in it. I wanted to take it back to the days of tough guys and try to make people care about what they were seeing. Their excuse was the fear of AIDS. And although that fear may have some validity, we were still seeing bloody boxing matches, football players getting hurt, but the referees and trainers stay safe. What a charade. I guess boxers, football players, basketball players, and so on can bleed all over each other, but we'll have referees wear rubber gloves. What made it worse was that it seemed to me that Bob Doohy was having some personal issues that were taken away from his time with WCW. And when Bob was there, things were great because he could look at a situation and not only know the answer, but know how to handle it politically. But I felt that Bill Shaw was trying to use Bob's absences as a way to have Bob fired. When WCW hired me in the spring of '92, one of the first things Bill Shaw wanted to know was whether I would fire Dusty Rhodes. Been the booker for about a year. And I said, sure, I can fire him. But that's not the issue. I want to find out if he can work for me. Because if he can work for me, I can control him. if he respects me, and I respect his talent and ability, for me to walk in and fire Dusty for what he's been allowed to do here would not be fair. He was doing what the system here allowed him to do. Dealing with Dusty was nothing new for me, just like in '74 when he was going around me to complain to Eddie Graham. I had to make sure he understood how serious the situation was. I walked into Dusty's office at WCW and said, "Dusty, here's the deal. I'm taking over, and part of the deal is I'm supposed to fire you. What I want to know is, can we work together? I know your abilities and your weaknesses, and I want to work with you. But you have to understand, I'm the boss." That was the Cowboy and the Cross, the Bill Watts story. Rebellion, Wrestling, and Redemption.